Cybersecurity is becoming more and more of a need in today's quickly changing world. Today's guest recently wrote an article published in the National Post entitled, "Why Banning Huawei is Just One of a Series of Steps Canada Needs to Take to Defend Itself." Christian Leuprecht is a security expert and a professor at the Royal Military College of Canada and at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario. Christian, welcome to Bridge City News.
Hello.
The Huawei controversy has created a lot of headlines, but I do wonder if the average Canadian really cares. They think to themselves, just a telecommunications company, what's the big deal? Can you explain how Huawei can pose a real threat to Canada's national security?
So I think this is generally the challenge that we have with anything in cyberspace and with regards to networks, data, cybersecurity in particular, that on the one hand, people have a relatively poor understanding of how that space works. It's a little bit like getting into your car. You don't understand exactly how the engine works. You just get in and it sort of runs. And then there's the Hollywood effect, where the understanding that people think they do have comes from movies that really convey a very adulterated version of how things actually work. And so you put those together, and it becomes very difficult to convey to people how the real world actually works on this particular issue. So let me take a step back and explain why, in particular, the Huawei issue is so controversial. You have to understand the basic structure of the internet, which is sort of a hierarchical structure of switches. And these switches direct essentially traffic and flow of traffic. And so there are only so many high-level switches within the network, and only so many, for instance, in North America. And so the more of the traffic you can see, the more of the traffic you can divert, the more of the traffic you can try to decrypt. And even if the traffic is encrypted, simply seeing the traffic patterns provides a significant amount of intelligence. And so the concern here is that whoever provides equipment for those top level switches could ostensibly try to manipulate that equipment to their advantage. And so the debate here is on whether a company that is closely linked with a country that in some ways is a partner, in some ways is a collaborator, but in other ways is very much an adversary, as we can see on other policy issues with regards to China, whether we want to give that sort of company unfettered access to the most critical parts of our critical communications infrastructure.
You know, it's very interesting to note as well, Christian, that China does not allow any foreign companies to operate in its own telecommunication infrastructure networks. How do you respond to that?
So this is one of the points that I have long made, that inherently trade, in particular in technology, should have reciprocity. And so why should we let a company compete in Canada where Canadian firms and other international firms cannot compete fairly in the same way on the Chinese market? But add to that the concerns around Huawei's behavior more broadly. So not only does it have a monopoly on the Chinese market, it receives upwards of $10 billion in subsidies a year, which means, of course, that companies that do not receive such subsidies have a harder time competing, because it means these subsidies can go into innovation, they can go into subsidizing some of the products that the company sells. But Huawei, of course, has a 30-year track record of poor competitive behavior, in particular when it comes to intellectual property. And in Canada, we've been recipients and we've suffered the consequence of that. Older viewers may remember a company called Nortel. Nortel Networks was, in the 1970s and 80s, the leading company in the world in providing said switches that I just talked about, a multi-billion-dollar global company. One of the first products that Huawei produced was essentially a Nortel switch that was reproduced down to the pages of the operating manual, instruction manual of that switch. And so it is, in particular in Canada, baffling to me that we would let a company that has built its own intellectual property and its international competitiveness on the backs of a Canadian multi-billion-dollar company that, as a result, effectively imploded and put thousands of people out of work, that we would let that sort of company then subsequently compete in an open and equitable fashion on the Canadian market.
Now, what about the actual cell phones themselves? If our citizens, politicians, and business people are using phones manufactured by a company controlled by China, what kind of risk does this really present?
So let's be clear. One of the reasons why, for instance, the telecommunications companies in Canada are lobbying hard against a ban on Huawei equipment in network infrastructure is that Huawei equipment is very good and it is very cost effective. And so we need to distinguish between different types of equipment. Yes, you run a certain risk with having a Huawei phone, but you run also a certain risk with having a Google Pixel phone that Google will keep track of your data in a way that, for instance, might be more difficult to do if you have a different type of product. And so those are probably manageable risks, but of course, anybody who buys a Huawei phone takes certain risks in that regard. The question is whether in the critical parts of our communications network infrastructure, we should allow equipment by a company that has not only the track record that I've laid out, but also a, shall we say, dubious relationship with Chinese authorities and with the Chinese government. And in Canada, in 2012, we already made the decision to ban certain types of Huawei equipment from critical Canadian government infrastructure. And so the question then is, how vulnerable are we prepared to leave our broader Canadian internet infrastructure to possible exploitation by an adversary, and to what extent do we want to mitigate those particular types of risks by either banning such equipment outright, or like Germany is looking to do, perhaps write procurement provisions in a way that makes it very difficult or impossible for certain companies to compete, such as those that don't operate in democratic systems, such as some of Huawei's competitors.
Now, I understand that intelligence sources say China has been actively mapping and analyzing the electrical grids and oil pipelines of Western nations. Should we be concerned about this?
So this is a standard procedure in the intelligence game, that you want to understand your competitors, your adversaries, where their possible vulnerabilities might lie in the case of a conflict. But certainly I think we should be, it's when you talk about threats, there are always two components. There's capability and there's intent. And so what China is demonstrating by having mapped these critical infrastructure systems is that it has the capability to map those systems. However, it has insisted, in particular Huawei has insisted, that it does not collaborate with Chinese intelligence. Of course, Chinese legislation requires all Chinese companies to collaborate with the government and its intelligence security services if called upon to do so. And so Huawei claims that no Trojan horses have ever been found in its network equipment that it provides. At the same time, of course, all this equipment has backdoors because, like your home computer, you need to update the software in that equipment. And so that means that while there's no intent today, perhaps, to cause vulnerability and exploitation within that critical infrastructure, that this can change overnight, and that these backdoors that are necessary in the equipment allow a hostile government potentially to exercise such intent in a very expeditious manner.
Now, Christian, some people argue banning Huawei would negatively affect trade with China, and welcoming Huawei into Canada would provide more competition and lower prices for consumers. How are you seeing it?
Yeah, sure. There's always costs and benefits to any policy and political decision in this regard. And so it is clear that a ban on Huawei, or perhaps not an outright ban on Huawei equipment network infrastructure, but perhaps certain restrictions, such as the ones we already have in place for government infrastructure, may well drive up costs, means perhaps a slower build out of the 5G network infrastructure. But I think the Canadian government also needs to show some resolution with regards to safeguarding the sovereign democratic decision-making capability of a constitutional rule of law government that is freely and fairly elected, which of course is not the case when it comes to the Chinese regime. And so we've already seen in current policy areas, such as, for instance, the extradition of Ms. Wang Zhu in Vancouver, the Huawei executive who's currently incarcerated or is being held, detained on request of extradition to the United States, that China is using multiple policy levers to try to change the government's minds. So now imagine if, in addition to the policy levers of political and economic levers, the Chinese government could now exploit vulnerabilities in our critical communications infrastructure in order to, for instance, slow internet traffic in Canada, cut off certain internet traffic, deliberately divert internet traffic, introduce malicious code and other vulnerabilities that might have economic and social consequences within Canada into our internet, in addition to the levers that it is already exercising. And so I would say that Canadian sovereignty is not discretionary, and that ultimately security policy is always a question of, it's kind of like buying insurance. How much coverage are you willing to buy, and how much are you willing to pay for that coverage? And my argument is here that this is an insurance coverage that ultimately Canada needs and wants to buy, because it is impossible or very difficult and costly to remove this type of equipment after the fact. And so we want to remove it from our infrastructure. So we need to, these are what's known as downstream constraints. And so we need to make the decision now as to how secure we want to be and what sort of safeguards we want to put in place.
With the theft of intellectual property and technology taking place more and more often, to what degree could this really be impacting the Canadian economy?
So there are repercussions for the potential repercussions for the Canadian economy, of course, in a couple of ways here. One is the ability of an adversary to manipulate Canadian networks and Canadian data or exploit those for hostile purposes. And of course, banning HUAWEI equipment or restricting it from infrastructure won't take out those vulnerabilities completely, because if you have a poorly built network, for instance, then you're still open to vulnerabilities. So there's many factors at work here. And it also then provides, having these vulnerabilities in your systems, more opportunity to leverage exploitation of commercial trade secrets, commercial espionage, intellectual property. At the same time, of course, it would allow an adversary to perhaps mount hostile attacks on entire sectors of Canadian prosperity and large Canadian companies or critical infrastructure sectors, whether that might be banking or electricity or pipelines or whatnot, as a way to try to change the government's mind. And so I think these are not the sort of vulnerabilities to which we want to expose ourselves if we value Canadian sovereignty and sovereign decision-making.
Christian, we hear reports that China is actually actively planting people into our educational, business, military, and political arenas in order to exert influence from the inside. Is this actually happening?
So this is what's known as the United Front activities. There's a number of things that have been written about, including a recent book with regards to Canada. It is not as widely known in Canada as, for instance, in Australia. China is not particularly shy about these activities. It is a deliberate, strategic effort and a long-term effort by China to obtain strategic trade secrets, political secrets, and to be able to leverage decision and influence making within countries. And so the broader issue of HUAWEI and Canadian critical communication infrastructure needs to be situated within these broader efforts by the Chinese regime. And these are efforts on which the current regime under Xi Jinping has very much doubled down and has made it quite public that they are fully committed to United Front activities in order to ensure China's competitiveness, both political, economic, as well as defense, intelligence, and security on the world stage. And so it is important for us to be aware that China is playing aggressively in this arena. And so this is why the conversation about HUAWEI is just one part of a much broader conversation that we ultimately need to have in Canada about what sort of activities are we prepared to tolerate and what sort of vulnerabilities are we prepared to have, and to what extent do we want to safeguard around this type of leverage, exploitation, and potential vulnerabilities within our broader Canadian society and infrastructure.
So Christian, bottom line, what does the Canadian government need to do to bring proper security to our communications networks?
The government ultimately has an opportunity here to show resolve. We've seen efforts in light of current efforts by the Chinese government to change our minds on the Meng Wanzhou case, the government has been slow rolling a decision on Huawei. And I actually think the Canadian government will want to be aggressive here and show that if China thinks they need to play hardball, that we can do so too. Of course, the reason why the Chinese are so concerned about a decision with regards to Huawei is that it poses serious reputational risk to the company as a whole. There's likely other countries that would fall in line with Canada once such a decision were made. And so it closes off significant markets. It means that one of the reputational risks of a crown jewel of Chinese industry is damaged. But it also means that if the company can no longer compete in certain aspects, it will means the company sells less material. That contributes to the slowdown of the Chinese economy, and that then contributes to undermining some of the legitimacy of the Chinese regime. And so I think Canada has an opportunity here to show resolve and to both make a decision on this critical issue while at the same time signaling very clearly to the current regime in Beijing that it is not open to being extorted in terms of our policy and political decision-making processes.
Christian Leuprecht is a security expert and a professor at the Royal Military College of Canada and at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario. Thanks a lot for joining me today from Ottawa, Ontario.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you.
On behalf of all of us here at BCN, I'm Hal Roberts. God bless, be safe, and have a great night.